Yuliya Yurchenko is a senior lecturer and researcher in political economy at University of Greenwich. She is currently in Ukraine on an extraordinary leave, and while she writes that she's for the moment in relative safety, that could of course change at any moment. Being a Ukrainian, an activist, and an academic, Yuliya traveled to Ukraine on February 19th as part of a fact-finding and solidarity mission with a number of MPs, trade unionists, and journalists. The goal, she says, of this mission is to connect with civil society organizations, trade unions, activists, and politicians, and to, quote, express direct cross-border solidarity from the UK working class to the Ukrainian working class. I find it stunning that when the delegation left on February 22nd, she decided to stay behind to support both her family there and the resistance to this ongoing campaign of Russian imperialist aggression that she stresses is far from a new phenomenon. In fact, she not only demands that Ukraine's foreign debt be cancelled as a means of allowing the country to recover and repair, but that the international community provide reparations for 8 years of inaction on Russian aggression. If we want to understand this war, Yuliya points out, it's going to be necessary to look past the headlines. The simplistic black and white portrayals we're receiving don't do justice to the complexity of the situation. And although she recognizes that this lack of nuance in large part results from a desire to give the public a, quote, coherent frame, it's just patently the case that right now conventional frames don't work, in her words, and for that reason we need to deeply reassess what constitutes evidence even, and develop methods of analyzing disinformation, emotion, belonging, statehood, and aggression beyond traditional Western scholarship and standard modes of political science. While we're still encouraged to think in terms of the rule of law when trying to understand these sorts of conflicts, Yurchenko emphasizes that societies without the rule of law require us to be more flexible in our theorizing. She says we need to incorporate interdisciplinary and open-minded frameworks to understand what's happening. This is what I kept hearing in my conversation with Yuliya, a tension between wanting to herself offer clarity and knowing that the whole situation is on some level hopelessly complicated. So for that reason, in part, she says she's necessarily hopeful that peace is possible, but has to be pragmatic about the evidence, which suggests that the war is going to drag on. She continues communicating publicly for peace. She talks at the beginning of our conversation about the fact that she derives a lot of strength from just fighting for a future through care, that these contributions to collective living on have become a kind of personal coping mechanism. It speaks to the spirit of Yurchenko's writing as well. Her book, Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, is not only full of profound analysis, it also, importantly, centers the living labor of workers, people who are focused not on extraction, profit, and domination, but on trying to care for themselves and their families. These people are not, as she puts it here, just pawns in imperialist games. They can't be understood in those terms, which is often how they're represented in the media. They deserve collective ownership of their future and to be trusted with it. But in the face of that, we have oligarchy, a system whereby assets, even virtual ones, are increasingly stashed away from the public. Oligarchs are using mechanisms available to them in a global capitalist economy in order to disguise their domination. And people like Putin exploit the global demand for oil. The aim has to be to recognize the, as she puts it, narcissistic sadism of empire, to understand the roots of colonialist and imperialist behavior in white supremacy and patriarchy. Putin embodies these things in a kind of sick, hypermasculine way, and he's established a kleptocratic regime in Russia, in part by naturalizing this abusive mentality. In the end, she argues that we must stop competing for the crumbs of empire. We need to imagine a future of demilitarization. We need to imagine a world in which hate and resentment and competition for those crumbs no longer drives world affairs. In short, to gesture to a moment at the end of this conversation, we need to imagine the future before we can build it. you've articulated an aggressively decolonial and anti-imperial and de-escalation politics, and so I'm really, yeah, I'm just like grateful that you could talk to me given your current situation.
Thank you for reaching out. I think it's important to get more critical narratives out there because
Hmm.
despite the coverage of this phase of this conflict, which is 8 years old, being significantly more advanced than what it was in 2014, not least because of defunding of Central Eastern European studies and Russian studies and correspondence over the years. Um, but still, we still get quite a lot of black and white
Hmm.
coverage, and yeah, and a little bit kind of polar attitudes, if you like. So I think it's important to develop analysis that are more nuanced and that also are not afraid of contradictions that are at place. So without romanticizing or denigrating either side,
Hmm.
we need to be able to assess critically the actions of everyone involved, and that's the only way that we can start thinking about what kind of trajectories of solutions and reconciliations and hopefully peacemaking can there be.
Yeah, and I think your thinking models that, which is why I wanted to obviously speak with you, but why I think everyone needs to spend some time with your book. But I mean, like, and just to that point of simplification and things being black and white, like, I am curious to know like how you are experiencing the conflict, how you're helping to organize for peace in the face of this war, and how you're managing, I mean, all the anxiety and grief you must be going through in relationship to, in part, not just the dire situation on the ground, but also the sense that there is, and your work is so insightful on this too, like an information war happening where the mainstream news in the West certainly is reporting the numbers, right? 1,200 civilians killed, 20 attacks on
Mm,
healthcare facilities,
yeah.
and reproducing footage out of Mariupol of the bombing of a maternity hospital. These things are tragic. It matters, I think, that the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Markarova, is saying that just flatly Ukraine is winning the war, even though it's hard to kind of see it in those clear terms. I guess, like, first of all, how are you assessing the state of the conflict right now?
I think that in terms of the resolve and spirits, Ukraine certainly is winning this conflict.
Hmm.
And considering what kind of blitzkrieg equivalent Russia was planning to have here, they haven't got it. Their military losses, their personnel losses, their machinery losses are colossal compared to the Ukrainian army, especially if we think about the proportions of what Ukrainian military represents compared
Hmm.
to the Russian military, or what at least they have been telling the world their military is. Because what we're actually seeing a lot is that the the many years and decades of corruption and embezzlement are reflected in the underpreparedness and the poverty of equipment of the Russian army that is coming in, from the fatigues to the machinery to the arms to the inside of these kind of borderline cardboard tanks. So that
Right.
there is that kind of dimension, and in that sense, I suppose, in the sense of the will to fight, the spirit, the kind of the morale of the troops and the morale of population, Ukraine is winning, and in many senses, in this conflict, Ukraine is on the right side of history. But there, of course, again, the story is not as black and white in that the civilian casualties, the destruction to infrastructure, the destruction to cultural heritage, to civil engineering object, to buildings that can be classed as kind of civil engineer objects. The residential buildings is immense already. The human suffering, the internally displaced people, the refugees, the collective trauma and the individual trauma on families, on environment, on pets and agriculture and husbandry
Hmm.
are immense, and that cannot be denied. When we hear politicians from Ukraine speaking with a lot of courage and resolve and strength and rigor, well, I applaud them for that, and it's their job, right? They need to keep the
Hmm.
morale going. They need to reassure the population that Ukrainian army has got it under control, that they're doing everything they can to protect our cities, to protect our population, that our territorial defense is has got things under control, and that we will win all of our cities back. They will be saying this, and they should be saying this, right?
Right.
And they're doing a really good job of it. But at the same time, they do recognize the losses. I think the way that the kind of the rhetorical style that they have chosen is actually quite useful and pragmatic in the current situation. But to say that, that it's some sort of like, neat victory or anything like that, or that we are one day away from declaring a full victory over Russians invading the country, we're clearly not quite there yet. And indeed, when such heavy losses have been sustained by both sides, no victory is by either side is going to be bloodless or unstained. So yeah, like in an absolute sense, there are no victors in any wars. you know there
Mm.
is, of course, the whole kind of historical relationship between Ukraine and Russia, and the kind of decolonial anti-imperial aspect of this war. And not that Ukrainian leaders necessarily frame it quite in those terms. Sometimes they do appeal to this historical relationship, sometimes in fortunate, sometimes in more unfortunate terms, but there is an appeal to the kind of historical claims that Russia has had with its imperial ambitions over what is now Ukraine. Yeah, but at the same time, the situation is quite complex. Of
Yeah.
course, the way that I see it, I'm not sure that I do remain hopeful that this horror will be over sooner than later. Yet, kind of the pragmatist in me thinks that it may drag for quite some time. And I try to focus on the positives, and as you say, like, how you cope with this. Well, the initial shock has worn off, and to some extent, you start losing an ability to cry. It's almost some sort of internal coping mechanism. There is a lot about this written in scholarship on trauma, especially wartime trauma. You start, in order to protect yourself from crashing, you start mentally distancing from what's going on, and as if kind of leaving your body and observing yourself as if you're in a film. You need to get on with everyday life. You need to maybe help the volunteers a bit, maybe cheer up a relative, maybe engage with some sort of localized support. Yeah, so I think
Hmm.
there are certain coping mechanisms, and one of those things, and we were talking about this with my organization, Social Movement here, the kind of the political left, that we each have our own station, our skills and our expertise, and something that we can contribute in this collective horror show. And one of the things that I can do that I know is meaningful, and it's probably more meaningful than me making soup to displaced people, is to have this interview with you and tell a story from a different angle, because this is something that I can do that probably not everybody else can do in the same way.
Hmm.
So if we all, and I've seen calls on social media locally and on a national, like on national forums, that people, especially in the cities, in towns where there isn't as much disruption and fighting, should try to carry on as normal as much as possible, like normal economic activity needs to carry on, various goods need to be produced, services need to be made, people need to continue being able to make money, to pay their bills, to keep the economy going, but also to produce goods that are needed for those whose cities are under siege.
Right.
And there is, and in that, I think I find strength in doing this interview with you, for example, or organizing campaigning around the debt cancellation of Ukraine. I'm involved in that. I've been in a couple of calls today, and we've organized a petition, and we are writing to different political parties with my organization. So, kind of that kind of front and that kind of fighting is very important, and it gives you strength to carry on, because you know that fighting for the future and the present, like immediate short-term and long-term of Ukraine, is not only on the barricades. It's also in cooking meals for those in the shelters. It's organizing their safe transfer away from bombs. It's in coverage. It's in adequate coverage in the media. It's in all sorts of different dimensions, and in getting engaged in that is a very useful coping mechanism. It's that, and also a form of kind of digital hygiene, or like rather information hygiene. So I dose news. So I give myself a couple, I read news in segments. It used to be kind of nonstop following all of the updates, and now I take breaks, because otherwise you just cannot do anything else. Like, you're constantly dragged into this black hole of horror.
Yeah.
Oh, you mentioned, what kind of other things would I do in terms of organizing. So I'm part of the Ukraine Solidarity campaign in the UK, and I'm part of the social movement or Соціальний рух, political organization in Ukraine that have long relationships of solidarity and collaboration. So through the Ukraine Solidarity campaign, I constantly communicate with them, and we're talking about what kind of meetings, what kind of parliamentary briefings can be done, what kind of demos and petitions and publications. And so those things are being done. So today, for example, they had a demo outside Gazprom office that continues operating in London as if nothing is happening. Despite so-called sanctions and whatnot, but that Gazprom office is operating as per business
Right.
as usual. So there was a demo there, and there will be after we've recorded this in an hour, there will be another political meeting with local activists in London, where some of my activist colleagues here in Ukraine will be present as well. So there is this kind of work with the Labour Party and different parliamentary committees, trying to brief them on what is going on in Ukraine, so that they can make more informed decisions about what's going on the ground. Here in Ukraine, with this organization, Соціальний рух, social movement, we've been organizing transport of meds for people in the shelters and on the barricades in Kiev and Kharkiv, for example, amongst other places, from Poland, because some of the medications, once the martial law was declared, some of the meds and, like first aid kits and, blood thickeners and a bunch of other things, anything that's on the list of tactical medication, those are difficult to, if not impossible to get in pharmacies, because you can get them only on prescription, or if you have an order from through one of the battalions, of territorial defense, or through the military. So if there are any sort of self-organized people, fighting in the streets, or if some of those, if something on that list is needed in the shelters, sometimes it makes more sense to kind of buy them in Poland and pass them through the train or by car here. Of course, there are also lots of various NGOs and volunteer organizations that have very well developed networks that date back to 2014, and since then, they still work, and they are quite organized. But there are still bits and pieces that are not catered for, so we try to kind of to help with that. But then there are also short-term and long-term needs of the country as a whole. So Ukraine, for example, Ukraine is riddled with the second largest debt with IMF. It's a heavily indebted economy, and we are now campaigning directly through writing to various politicians and through organizing a petition and working with different organizations, such as, for example, the Debt Jubilee campaign of the UK, to get Ukraine's foreign debt written off and to lobby for more financial aid to Ukraine, so it can actually prioritize the military and humanitarian needs of its population right now, rather than servicing its crippling debts. So those kind of things.
Yeah, that's incredible. It sounds like you're just like doing the work of relentlessly trying to build collective power. And I can't imagine what it means to have to like steel yourself to do that. But obviously, you just consider it to be necessary. And one of the things you said reminded me of a comment you made in a recent panel titled "No War in Ukraine" that people can watch on the YouTube channel for Another Europe is Possible. Again, one of these engagements that you've been doing. You argued that a central part of the problem globally is, you talked about debt, but you also talked about just the acceptance of existing conflicts as normality. You say there's basically this kind of slippery slope where the international community looks at border violations and mass violence as somehow normal, as long as it doesn't cross some political threshold. And against that slippage, you take a hardline anti-imperialist position and say that, quote, there won't be any stability without US and Russia dialing back security strategies, stashing away the weapons, and acting together to demilitarize the world globally. And the solution that you offer in that conversation is labor-centric demilitarized solutions, which is in some ways what you're describing, right? These sort of networks of people.
Yeah.
And you admit, though, that like that sort of revolutionary politics is hard to envisage right now. Because, of course, there is this, this doom rhetoric of we're on the brink of World War III, where in order to halt the Russian advance, the only imagined solution is direct military support, right? So the establishment of a no-fly zone using U.S. military power, this is the limits of it seems like the imperialist imaginary. Tariq Ali just recently said that, the only way out is agreeing to a conference in which certain parts of Ukraine are basically ceded to Russia. And that struck me as, like kind of outrageous,
Yeah.
even though he's presenting it as this rational thing. Like this is assuming that a madman like Putin will be appeased by that, right? Like, and this is, this is something Tony Wood, who wrote the book Russia Without Putin, also talks about, that Putin seems to be now actually insane, that his irrational hopes in Ukraine are to tear the country apart in order to show that the West is not going to rescue you, that the Ukrainian government will need to basically give up territory in order to stop the terror. What's your position on this rhetoric around NATO needing to intervene militarily now to stop the spread of Putin's violence? And what of this kind of concept of partitioning the country as like a reasonable solution?
I'm glad, as you mentioned it in the email as well, I'm glad that you mentioned the kind of the Tariq Ali thing, because I get really frustrated with some parts of international left, mainly Western left, and with some of the doyens of the progressive thought, shall we say. And I try to not go after the names because I just can't be bothered at this point. There is too much going on, but also it's petty, and we'll sort it out when the dust settles. But when Tariq comes out with this kind of suggestion in inverted commas, it just makes my blood boil more than Putin's bombs, because you expect a little bit more from somebody who held an anti-imperialist position his whole life. There are actual people living on the territory of Ukraine, and if you also start seeing them as some sort of pawns in imperialist games, just as some imperialistic powers do, then to my mind, you lose all moral right to continue commenting on the situation. But I'll come back to that in a minute. You've mentioned, there is I have been talking about like labor-centric solution, and I indeed think that in the long run, what we need to be thinking about post this horrendous crisis, whenever it will end, is global demilitarization, because this is something that and we need to be thinking about how we will manage the end of this war now, because with the growing hate and growing suffering and justified hate and anger, absolutely justified and justifiable, the risks are that once whatever kind of agreement is achieved and ceasefire is in place, there will be a push for further militarization and arming of more countries with heavier weapons, with more potential destruction, and we have to avoid that at all costs. This is not something that will bring us a more peaceful world. But of course, that kind of demilitarization will mean that some of the first people who will have to put down the weapons after Russia is pushed to do that will have to be the United States. They will have to lead that process. And it's hard to envisage that, but we need to imagine the future before we can build it. And we need to learn from this horrendous escalation, not that keeping the NATO after 1991 was a historical mistake. There was no reason for it to stay around, but to keep selling weapons and stoke conflicts. But I don't want to focus on NATO too much, kind of on the kind of validity of it, or kind of the right for it to exist. Like I really do not think that military alliances that kind of sell weapons and wars around the world should be around at all, because they if you spend so much money, if so much money research and development into building weapons of the magnitude and complexity as the United States do, well, you do not build them to put them in a museum. You build them to participate in wars. So you need to,
Of course,
it kind of preconditions a lot of different things. And then when it comes to the point where those weapons are potentially are about to potentially be used, then it becomes a little bit more clearer to a lot of politicians and people on the ground that exactly how lethal and how lethal those weapons are, and how ecologically also detrimental they are. And we need to think about that as well, even though it's often not the top of the conversation.
it's
But
true.
also how unwilling we are to actually use those weapons, because the no-fly zone, and I agree on this, that no-fly zone that a lot of people in Ukraine are calling for means means unleashing yet even more violent phase in this horrendous conflict, and it will mean more suffering. It will mean clashes of fighter jets of the top order of U.S., NATO, various countries over this in the sky of Ukraine, over Ukrainian land, and it will mean more destruction. We've seen what happens when NATO air forces come into countries. There will be what we see now in Mariupol. There will be way more of it. So I'm holding this position that some in Ukraine will not necessarily automatically agree with, but because there is so much destruction and suffering happening right now that many believe that once the sky is closed, that somehow the situation will become more peaceful and it will be easier to protect Ukraine. I do not believe that. I think it will mean a further escalation of the conflict. And we have this kind of horrendous cost benefit analysis of what will bring less and what kind of actions will bring more destruction and suffering. To that end, things that people like Tariq, like the narratives like Tariq's, Ali's are suggesting, that perhaps let's just kind of agree and give a little bit of concessions to Putin just to prevent further escalation. Well, that's what we did in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
When they've taken the Crimea and they've taken parts of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. Has that stopped Putin? Has that appeased him? No maniac in the history of the world has stopped by getting a bit and getting away with it. It should have been nipped in the bud. It should have been nipped in the bud in Chechnya, in Abkhazia. It should have been nipped in the bud when people were gassed by Russians, and it wasn't. And of course, this all of this is happening in the international context, where international institutions that are aimed to prevent conflicts, such as the United Nations, have been dysfunctional for years. Not least because they allowed United States get away with all sorts of crimes and spitting onto the rules. So when Russia started breaking those rules, nobody could seriously, hit them on the head and say, "Well, you can't do this." And Putin said it directly to various commentators and correspondents and politicians. Well, United States were told not to go into Iraq, and they did. Why can't we?
This is what's used as the justification. Yeah, this kind of whataboutism argument. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I do not side with him at all, but I'm just saying this to suggest that the international so-called order has been disorderly for a very long time, and it either works for the rules either apply to everyone or they don't.
Exactly.
And there have been precedents that created that allowed for these narcissistic sadism of Putin to blossom to what it had. And I like some commentators, like Oksana Shevin, for example, an excellent Ukraine scholar, used this frame recently as well. I like thinking, because you look at Putin's behavior, and a lot of it doesn't make sense, but some of it does. But what does allow us make some sort of sense of what he's doing is trying to understand his relationship, Putin's regime relationship, Russia's relationship to Ukraine through the frame of domestic violence and narcissistic relationships. Entitlement, belittling, devaluation, this kind of love bombing while hitting, displaced affection and aggression simultaneously. It's all in there. It's all in there. And again, we're coming back to kind of geopolitical foreign policy analysis. It's very classic colonial imperialistic behavior. He feels entitled to this land. If you have a problem with NATO, start a war with NATO. Don't start a war in Ukraine. In 2014, Ukraine had no intention of joining NATO. It was a completely fabricated situation. So these suggestions of somehow partitioning Ukraine to prevent civilian deaths. Well, what's going to happen to people in the occupied territories?
Mm-hmm.
What is going to happen with them? Do you think their lives will be spared? Are they going to have a jolly life? But also, the people on the territory of Ukraine have sent a very clear message that they do not want to be under Russian occupation.
Yeah, of course.
So who is Tariq Ali or anybody else to say that, why don't we just kind of, give a couple of cities to Russia and then we're going to spare some lives? Well, what about the lives of people in those potentially occupied cities?
Yeah, there's no consideration for that.
No. It's a continuation of the imperialistic propaganda of Moscow. And I will never agree that, especially on the left, we should be taking this kind of narrative and position.
Yeah, I mean, and I appreciate that kind of moral clarity in some sense, right? Like, and I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, or that we were discussing earlier, around this kind of the fundamental messiness and complexity of the situation. But to just kind of jump off of what you were saying, and that really profound insight about the kind of imperialist mindset being akin to like a domestic abuser, combining a certain kind of like love bombing with just outright violence. There's this disconnect between Putin's bizarre rhetoric of denazification as a pretense for war, and many have pointed out the irony of that given Zelensky's background.
Yeah,
but Russia repeatedly lies in order to justify the war on sort of humanitarian grounds. Saying that Russian-speaking residents in the Donbas region have been subjected to genocide. That Ukrainian forces bombed a kindergarten in eastern Ukraine in mid-February. All of these claims to paint Russia as intervening on sort of humanitarian and ethical grounds. All of these things
have been contradicted, all of these lies. But your book talks about how information wars create a certain kind of virtual reality, and so
Yeah.
it begs the question, like, does it even matter that the lies are outed, right? The lies still produce reality in some sense, and Ukraine is now being forced to face that reality, right? So it becomes very difficult to find the room for complexity, right? Like this is the kind of bind that you're in, where it's either Putin is a savior or who's eradicating fascism in Ukraine, or Ukraine doesn't have any neo Nazis. It's like it's always either or. And so I guess like the question is, why do you think we can't get a nuanced portrayal of the situation? Is it a strategic necessity on both ends to kind of create this sort of east-west, good versus evil picture? And what are the consequences?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I like complex questions. I think one of the reasons why it's difficult to get a nuanced analysis, because you need to have a coherent frame,
Mm-hmm.
right, to make sense of something, like how we do it in analytical scholarship. We choose a specific frame, and through that we kind of try to make sense of something.
Mm-hmm.
But what is needed here is is an understanding that conventional frames don't work, that you need to have a different methodological approach. You need to treat what constitutes evidence differently. So you need to review your epistemological, methodological, and ontological standings that are so conventional in Western scholarship, and that really undermines a lot of kind of honed down political science approaches here. I've been one of the things that I've been developing in my scholarship and with scholars I heard in different conference streams is precisely that, is that you cannot use methodological, ontological, and epistemological frames that have been developed in societies where there is a rule of law and then try to analyze a society where there isn't. However imperfect the rule of law is, and I do not have any naive views about it. I've lived in the UK for almost 18 years. I have an idea. um, you need to be much more flexible, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
And like one of the things, as we've just mentioned, this kind of for example, use psychological frameworks of understanding relationships to understand how foreign relations work between Ukraine and Russia. So it kind of looking like having much more interdisciplinary and open-minded approaches to understand how these things work. And what you said was actually quite interesting. Is you say that there isn't very often there isn't logic, or that there are all of these contradictions in how Russia justifies its um, its behavior towards Ukraine. It's in one sentence it says it's invasion, in another sentence it says it doesn't. These famous letters justifying Ruski Mir and Ukraine, kind of Ukraine Russian brotherhood, whatever, that Putin occasionally publishes, issues that gets read by all of his army and administrators. Like there is so much non sequitur in them. There is such a salad of various historical bits that for any scholar you just kind of go, whoa, this doesn't add up on any level.
Right.
But it does create this virtual reality, and in the words of Pyotr Pomerantsev, nothing then after that kind of stuff, nothing is true and everything is possible. And it doesn't have to add up,
Mm-hmm.
because when people don't believe anything that comes out, when they're too easy to convince that anything that is being shown to them as evidence is just a fabrication. There's been you probably have seen, I don't know, there's been such a flow of information, I don't know if you've seen or not, but there's been videos circulated of people in the cities of Russia being interviewed by Western correspondents. Like they were trying to show them the bombing of Ukrainian cities and asking them what they think about the war. And as soon as these people get approached in the street, they go, "I'm with Putin. I don't want to know anything. This is all lies. Nothing is happening there. We trust him." And there is this kind of weird combination of denying reality, kind of unwillingness to engage, there will be some sort of, mix, some sort of fear in that mix, because we are talking about Putin's Russia, and what can happen if you criticize Putin or his policies in there and his conduct. But there is this kind of like weird reality being created, and indeed it kind of doesn't quite make sense, and this whole thing about protecting Russian speaking population. So Kharkiv is a predominantly Russian speaking town, and they have been fighting tooth and nail trying to keep Putin's troops out. But also the whole kind of pretext of the invasion this time round, well, Russian troops have been on Ukraine's territory since 2014. Why, the second Minsk agreement was signed in 2015. Why would Ukraine wait till Russia brought all these troops to its borders to start killing its civilians? If you look at how it's all being presented in the Russian TV, in the fake salad of history that is being pushed on Russian TV as kind of pretext justification, it all does make sense, because all of these years they've been saying that the West is after Russia, that they're encircling Russia, that Ukrainians are developing all sorts of weapons and they're preparing to attack and retaliate, and they're after these poor DNR, LNR republics. That kind of stuff has been stoked up for years. So within that frame, it makes sense. So you kind of, if you try to kind of have a bit of a more nuanced analysis, some of them are now coming out of, more Russian scholars of Russia are now being listened to and a lot of them who were saying for a number of years now that Putin has lost it. They're going to start going into crazy wars. The domestic discourse is completely off the tracks. Those commentators were being treated as if they are kind of being hysterical, and they weren't.
No, yeah.
Right. So I think that kind of bringing more of that scholarship into the kind of common sense understanding of what's going on in Russia and in Russian justification for their foreign policy is something that needs to happen. So I'm hoping, and I'm seeing a kind of a little bit more of that nuanced analysis coming out, but we need to be seriously rethinking what do we understand by rigorous scholarship, and being more flexible with our methodological, ontological, and epistemological frameworks when we try to make sense of something that doesn't quite fit our conventional frame of understanding.
Absolutely, yeah. Like some basic notion of truth needs to be unsettled here.
Oh, absolutely.
And like you mentioned, the kind of trickle of more and more insightful commentary on that. Ilya Budretsky's has said that there's this generational divide that we need to reckon with if we're to oppose the war. I think that's worth maybe thinking through, because he points out young people have greater access to information in Russia, while the older generation especially is receiving their information from state-run media pretty much exclusively.
Yeah.
And so, the political technologists, as you call them, from Russia are splitting the country in half along these kind of generational lines. And of course, there's a certain level of desperation as Putin is throwing people in jail for as many as 15 years for opposing. This is the new law that he's enacted for contradicting the narrative around the war. This is something that, as I say, you describe as information warfare in your book, a form of kind of communicational warfare that necessarily happens, as you put it, in an information vacuum. And I guess what I'm hearing you say is that those strategies are better understood now. Whether that understanding actually prevents the effects of it, they're better understood, this kind of post-truth universe. And I guess like the practical question is like, how does the information blockade, to use another term from your book, get dismantled in Russia? I mean, some communicators in the West have leaned heavily on this, this dim hope that Russians will be using VPNs to get around the information blockade, but that seems extremely limited. And I guess like from your perspective, thinking back on some of the insights of your book, like what role does social media play this time around? Is it just another tool for manufacturing opinions, for propaganda and manipulating social reality? Or do you think it can be a meaningful counteroffensive against oligarchic and state-controlled media?
It is a very interesting and a very important question because, and I agree with Ilya that his commentary is always extremely nuanced and thoughtful. He's a great voice. There is this generational divide, and indeed, I kind of we can. There are all sorts of jokes going on around Ukraine now that there are all these people like whose heads are full of cotton wool. They're called like vatniki, who just kind of can't think for themselves and so on and so forth. But you know it and I know it. If we all make decisions on the basis of the information that's available to us, if we only get one specific type of information fed to us the whole time from one type of source, well, is it that we can't make sense of it? Is it that we simply haven't heard a different narrative for a very long time?
Right.
And in an atmosphere of distrust, in an atmosphere of like when there are enough fears and insecurities, those kind of there are and with smart political technologies and propagandists, people are relatively easy to manipulate. It's actually much easier than we like to think we are to manipulate. So that kind of the generational divide is important to tackle, and indeed young people are a bit more digitally literate, and they have access to different sources of information, and they generally kind of they grew up with a lot of different technologies, and they know how the echo chambers work and so on and so forth. But again, as you yourself say, it's not the majority of population, but the kind of there is a change in the society, and we haven't seen the extent of it yet, because, not least because it is very dangerous to kind of come out on the streets or organize yourself politically quite vocally, because the cost is extremely high. So with the information blockade, I think it can sort of it can do two things, well, more than two things, but like two off the top of my head. So on the one hand, we can say that that the Russian television can hammer even more rubbish into the heads of Russian people, but at the same time, when you're there is a counter reaction, because when your government starts blocking social media, starts blocking all sorts of satellite channels, like cancels a bunch of TV channels that, like, as soon as they disagree with you, they get dissolved. That also makes people think,
Right.
right? Like, why are all of these people all of a sudden enemies of the people just overnight?
Right. That disappearance is made visible, right? It's apparent.
Precisely. And also we need to think about, so there are, with the information blockade, and which is actually quite interesting. You said that there is the whole VPN thing, but a couple of retirees with a small TV in the corner of their room will not necessarily be using that, will they? But what our comrades from the anonymous group were doing is they were hacking into all sorts of like state TV, not just satellite but cable state TV channels, and were showing videos of bombing of Ukrainian cities, marches of Ukrainian people through the cities with their flags going, "Russians, get out, you're not welcome here." They were doing that. They've been doing this now for 2 weeks.
Wow.
And that's been fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So there are ways of getting through that information blockade, because there are a lot of friends and allies elsewhere, because if your propaganda rests on these fabricated narratives and twisted history salad, well, there are also, you are not the only one who has that kind of weapon. There are savvier people who can fight you back on that. So I'm not trying to overestimate the effect of this, but just to highlight that info blockade can be broken, and it does get broken regularly. As for the social media, whether it's a kind of tool for good or tool for ill, well, it's kind of both. I've seen the power, the organizing and connectivity power of it in Ukraine. So a lot initially people were using Facebook a lot, and then I'm talking 2014 and kind of around that time, and a bit earlier. But a lot of that kind of organizing has moved to Telegram and Signal, because they're much safer. of course, and you can't be tracked as easily. But social media platforms have been used. Of course, they get used for disinformation, and we all know about Cambridge Analytica, and in the United States, there is its own story about what social media has been doing with elections.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, those platforms do allow for grassroots organizations to organize, to mobilize, to signal about certain things happening here or there, to upload videos of specific abuses, uh, torture, beatings, you name it, instantly, and make that story global. And that is, again, I'm not trying to romanticize it, but it is a very powerful weapon, because then that evidence is there. And that also, the power of that is recognized in Russia. And this is why Putin's regime is blocking all sorts of social media,
Sure.
specifically so that alternative stories to the Russian state propaganda is not being shared. So I think it can be a force for good, and it can be a force for propaganda. It can be either, but it's sometimes, it's sort of, sometimes it's the best you got.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like ultimately, it is a tool for collective self-education,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be wielded in multiple ways. In the same way that unity and solidarity can be weaponized, and then also be a source for liberation and peace. I mean, this is something I wanted to talk about in relationship to the way that your book theorizes the state itself as an entity, right? Like it contains these long theoretical passages where you're thinking about how states are formed. And to me, this is rooted in this kind of, in some sense, collective self-education, this narrative or mythology that you build in order to have something like a coherent or stable sense of your own nation. I mean, what you say is that the nation is not, quote, just an empty bureaucratic entity. It's made up of people. And you say, like, the reality is that neoliberal marketization is an offensive on any other form of statehood. And I wanted to kind of use this as a way of talking both about the question of sort of states and how they're formed and reproduced, but also how economies are themselves kind of normalized and reproduced, like a specific economic model. Like this idea that I think there's a latent desire in your book to at least raise the question of what actually is the Ukrainian nation. You say, like, is it a thing that needs revival or construction?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's the latter, should you construct it from scratch or on the basis of some historical foundation? And that literally now feels or seems like a life or death question. And the truth that you want to underscore in the book over and over again is that the myth of two Ukraines is destructive. It's an incredibly destructive myth because, in truth, Ukraine is a, quote, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-religious country. So that fiction that there are just two Ukraines is about a specific kind of manipulation that conflicts with what you call class formation and accumulation struggles between foreign and domestic capital, oligarchs, the EU, the US, and Russian business interests. So, I mean, just thinking about this in relationship to the current struggle, like, how does, for example, the work of decolonization differ from this kind of, ethno-nationalist rhetoric? And how do you see Ukraine being kind of like denied a right to real, independent, multicultural, multi-ethnic existence? I mean, where do you find unity, I guess, in this moment?
Yeah, it's a very important question, especially as you say, it is a crucial historical juncture, because it was already quite, um, it was made an urgent and problematic and painful question by, at the moment of Russian invasion, um, in 2014, annexation of Crimea, because the rhetoric, actually, there was already early 2007, 2009 from Putin's office, and in some other spots as well, but there were some famous speeches he's made during those years where Ukraine's right to independent statehood has been questioned. So those people who are surprised now that Putin doesn't recognize Ukraine's right to self-determination haven't been listening to him. He was loud and clear about it.
Mm-hmm.
And hello, 2014, he's invaded the country, saying that it's a kind of a made-up state. Well, which state isn't made up? I haven't met
Exactly.
one so
Yeah, yeah.
far. You know, but the whole thing of, you know, Ukraine being an entity, and there's this kind of the myth of two Ukraines. Now it's becoming even more urgent and more sensitive, sensitive, to put it mildly, a political topic. You know, in this interview with Democracy Now! That Tariq Ali has recorded a couple of days ago, or was it yesterday? I don't know. I watched it this morning. There is also this kind of appeal that, oh, you know, the majority of country wanted to be kind of closer with Russia, and that so one part wanted to be closer with Russia, but another part wanted to be closer with the West, and that is just bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
In 1991, there was a referendum, all-national referendum on independence of Ukraine, where the people who lived in the 2013 boundaries of Ukraine wanted to be an independent nation, independent state called Ukraine. And in some areas, up to over 90% voted yes. In the Crimea, it was something like today. I don't remember the exact numbers, so please forgive me. I don't want to kind of belie the actual statistic, but it was something to the tune of 60 plus, 70 in some spots. In Donbass, it was still quite high, 70, 80, depending on the kind of district and so on and so forth. So it wasn't as overwhelming as in the West, but it was still very significant.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and the kind of the lower rate of that in the Crimea made sense because the Russian Navy officials would retire and stay living in their dachas in Crimea. So of course they wouldn't vote for anything else. They wouldn't go back to where their families were before they became military. They would stay in the Crimea because the weather is nice and it's nice climate, and why not? You're kind of on a state-funded summer house. So. So that kind of the division into two Ukraines is actually, it's something that became a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yes, in some regions there are more people who kind of for who Russian is a kind of primary language. In some areas, it's kind of there are more of those who speak Ukrainian, but pretty much everybody is bilingual in Ukrainian. People switch back and forth, and most people, including myself at home, we speak some sort of odd mixture of both, which is called surzhyk. And in every region, it's a bit different because depending on which kind of empires through the history of Ukraine you were under, you kind of absorb different bits of it. And to highlight kind of how oppressed, just kind of a bit of a side comment, like how oppressed, so to speak, in inverted commas, Russian was as a language in Ukraine. So I grew up in Vinnytsia, which is center-west Ukraine, close to Moldova border.
Mm-hmm.
It's a regional center, like a borough center or state capital of Vinnytsia Oblast. And there were 33 or 34 state schools in the city of 350,000 people in 89, out of which 3 had the language of instruction as Ukrainian. In the rest of schools, Ukrainian was taught as a foreign language. So that's the oppression of Russian, right? When Ukraine, and I was bullied for being from the losers' school, being a teenager, because Ukrainian speaking schools were like losers' school. So that's the oppressed Russians, right? And so when Ukraine, when this kind of language question gets brought to the fore, and indeed kind of adopting this kind of like there was some like poor timing around language laws after Yanukovych fled in 2014. But when Ukrainians are saying we're not going to have Russian as the second official language, they are not claiming an ethno-national state. They're decolonizing from centuries of Russian imperialism and Russification.
Mm-hmm.
Like there were times during the Russian Empire rule over what is now Ukraine, where you could go to Siberia for 20 years for singing a Ukrainian song.
Wow.
Because Ukrainian culture and language was to be eliminated. And there was Catherine the Great, and there were people before her who wanted to destroy, because the territories of Ukraine, they were in the territory of the present day Ukraine. There were different forces through its history who were fighting against Russian colonialism. The most famous, of course, is the Cossack Republic, right? So that needed to be eliminated. So but because Ukrainians are white and they are in Europe, they're kind of they fall through the cracks of post-colonial, decolonial scholarship that is still stuck in the what I call the hall of mirrors of West European colonialism of Latin American and African countries. And with their own, ethnocolor schemes and linguistic schemes. So, but there were different imperialisms and colonialisms, and we need to remember that. So, Ukraine, when it became independent and it voted for independence, like in the constitution that was adopted and updated from the previously Soviet one, a few years after Ukraine became independent, it's written in there that all minorities, all languages are to be cherished, respected. In any area there is, I don't remember the exact proportion, but if there is a certain proportion of certain ethnic population, you can get state-funded school so that your kids study in that language. There are different cultural programs and so on and so forth. The only thing that Russian didn't get was the state of the second official language. And that in itself was enough for Russia to kick off and use it as a pretense of oppression. 90% plus in 2013 of printed press was in Russian in Ukraine. Yeah, so we need to kind of remember about that. And I do think that, the collective identity of Ukrainians, of Ukraine as a nation state, should be built on those principles of Benedict Ardenson's imagined community, and that is everybody who politically chooses to be a Ukrainian, no matter what color, no matter what religion, no matter what gender they are, what gender, sex, whoever they are, if you choose to be a part of this country, that's the collective identity that constitutes Ukrainian.
Mm-hmm.
And that is written in the constitution. And if you see who's fighting in the territorial battalions, if you see what kind of, we have, kind of people we have on TV, what kind of people we have in the parliament, we have different ethnicities of different linguistic and religious communities. It's not a country that's kind of built in some sort of ethno-national state. And indeed, people who call themselves ethnic Ukrainians are themselves a product of mixture of all sorts of peoples going through the territory of Ukraine, because it has been on the crossroads of empires for centuries. So it would be ridiculous to claim that there is some sort of purity to what is Ukrainian. Like generally, ethnic purity is a fiction of sick minds, right? So I think that it's important to look to the history of Ukrainian nation formation as in nation state formation and independence formation. But when we talk about political subjectivity of what constitutes Ukrainian, it needs to be this multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, including atheists like myself, people who care about this land, who care about its people, and want to build the best of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think some of the appeal of digging through history and some regalia, a lot of people started wearing these embroidered shirts and everything else, which I find I find it irksome a bit, I have to admit.
Mm-hmm.
I probably won't earn any friends by saying this, but it was basically but I understand why this was happening, because the very existence of an identity that's independent from Russian has been questioned and used as a pretext for a military invasion. Who wouldn't try to dig through history and go, no, wait a minute, we actually do have something of our own,
mm-hmm.
right? So that context is very important. It's not like Ukrainians out of the blue decided to kind of dig through their history and say we're the superior nation and started invading their neighbors. No, it's the opposite.
That's right. And to that point, I mean, so many, powerful points made there, just trying to widen. I wanted to pick up on this idea of trying to widen the frame of decolonial studies beyond a certain kind of hall of mirrors that is itself like truly, reductive. There's been on the left in the West, at least, this kind of reckoning around the disproportionate coverage of the conflict in Ukraine, and the sense that the reason why it's front of our minds is in part, as you said, the whiteness of the kind of prototypical Ukrainian political subject. And so, the idea, I guess, here is that the crisis is revealing this contradiction that we already kind of knew was there, where, the question of Palestine is just not front page news. It's the case that gets kind of sidelined. But, it has become sort of central to the one part of the discussion around Ukraine. And I guess I wanted to ask, like, are you sympathetic to that sort of critique, or do you think there's something exceptionally threatening about this specific incursion that does warrant the level of coverage? And where do you, I guess, see a Eurocentric lens limiting kind of the coverage of the particular impact of the crisis on, for example, African and Asian refugees fleeing Ukraine?
Thank you for this very important question. I agree that the kind of the perceived Europeanness and whiteness of Ukrainians is is part is part of the kind of different treatment of Ukrainians here. Geographical location of the country is very important as well. But also,
Mhm.
what we need to remember is that Ukrainians started being treated as European and white, as in equal to other Europeans, as in EU Europeans, only 2 weeks ago. I've faced discrimination, and I was told to go home in the UK a number of times, and I was asked whether I'm an exotic dancer or a cleaner of plates, or whether I'm looking for a husband. I've been asked that by gross men in pubs. So
Yeah.
that kind of stuff and that kind of attitude is like, oh, you're the poor man of Europe kind of thing, or woman, or whatever that is that you are. And again, like, not that there is anything wrong with being a dancer or a table cleaner, but there are those kind of stigmatizing stereotypes that exist.
Hmm.
And that kind of attitude that's reflected in visa regimes, that's reflected in cultural attitudes, it was there the whole time. And now all of a sudden it's like, actually, look, this they actually are like us. But also I think that there is this kind of combination of, we've kind of othered these people, but they do look like us. But also, if we do not do anything about this, there is a realization that Putin will not stop on the border of Ukraine.
Hmm.
Right? But this kind of, so there is that the geopolitical and geographic thing. But I completely agree that there is this kind of the ugly aspects of othering and racism that's inbuilt in the refugee and migration policies and attitudes in Europe and globally, is really showing its face. We've seen the scenes on the border where foreign students, non-white students who were trapped, who were studying in Ukraine, and now they were trapped on the border. They were trying to flee the country from the bombs. They had lots of problems crossing into Poland, for example, and there were some really ugly scenes at the border. And I agree with that. And I feel that sentiment, and I empathize with that sentiment that, well, when this is happening with Palestinians or Syrians, kind of the coverage isn't nearly the same. The kind of the language that is being used to discuss humanness and the degree of civilization, this kind of really odd and grotesque language,
Hmm.
like the way that the way that refugees from Syria are discussed, and the way that refugees from Ukraine are discussed, are completely different ways. And there is this, what I think is very important for us as commentators, as scholars of this, for the journalists, but more importantly for politicians, and especially those on the left, is to not allow this to create a rift between us, but rather to for everybody in Ukraine right now. And we're doing this with this political organization I'm a part of. When we're talking about free passage for refugees from Ukraine, we're talking about everyone in Ukraine, and we're talking about all refugees in Europe. We're not talking only about Ukrainians.
Hmm.
And I think this is something that actually we can, because it can get used to basically yet again split and make rifts politically between different groups who are competing for the crumbs of the table of empires. And we shouldn't allow that to happen. We should actually use this kind of opportunity where the ugly face of refugee treatment in the EU has been revealed yet again, where the mask slipped, and say, wait a minute, so you can treat refugees with a bit more dignity. Why are Syrian refugees different from Ukrainian?
Hmm.
Why? We demand dignity and respect in treatment of all people who are fleeing bombs that you are selling to somebody else. And that is something like, I think especially on the left, what is very important is actually unite around this issue, condemn poor treatment of non-white people on the border in Ukraine and elsewhere, and reframe the whole kind of narrative, kind of use this example of Ukrainian crisis to say, wait a minute, like where is the color politics of all of this? This needs to be seriously addressed. But I agree that there's been horrendous scenes, and we see the kind of the racism that some of us have always known is there, is being made very public.
Mm-hmm.
In the kind of in migration, but generally kind of refugee treatment and humanitarian treatment of people. And we need to build an international campaign around this, because this is part of global decolonizing narrative.
To me, just again, I think it flows from what you were just saying. Like it's fundamentally about knowing who the actual enemy is, right? The enemy, in some sense, is the structure of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And so, I mean, like the piecemeal way in which we attack that enemy is never going to be enough. These struggles need to be linked. And so, like to that end, I guess I wanted to invoke the words of Hannah Perakota, who recently spoke for a panel on Haymarket Books YouTube channel. And she talked about she talked about blocking the assets of this oligarchic clan that, Putin is waging war on behalf of, who she said are clearly committed to any levels of, quote, barbarism to secure their power. But according to the publication Mother Jones, many oligarchs have been preparing by layering more and more levels of anonymity on the ownership of their most valuable assets, moves that now limit Western governments' ability to root them out. So this kind of task of divesting, of withdrawing the financial foundations from under these oligarchs is not necessarily going to work. And I guess it's just the case that I've rarely seen the media explain where the wealth is coming from. And so the first question is, why can't most of the public really take seriously the role of neoliberal capital itself in producing the concentration of military and political power that we're seeing just, wreak havoc on Ukraine? And your book is in some ways about trying to make these informal networks and black holes in the economy visible to us. Does it, from your perspective, how do you render those things visible? Is it about just kind of basically giving people the vocabulary? And do you think people are starting to gain that?
Well, it is very important to make these kind of what I call black holes in the economy visible. And sometimes it's a bit trickier, sometimes it isn't. But the thing is that, you see, as much as various assets are being made more virtual these days, and they kind of get created out of thin air, and value creation is quite something else these days than it was 50, 100, let alone 150 years ago, it is still not untraceable, right? There are records, and there are transfers, and there are stashes of cash in offshores, and there are shell companies, and there are legal services that register those companies. So there are traces. The problem of tracing those traces is the sheer amount of those various entities, the secrecy around where they're registered, who their actual owners are, the ability to move money in split seconds from one corner of the earth to another. Well, they do not physically move, but you get what I mean. Their accounts get shifted so quickly that it's not the easiest of things to do. But so exposing these, and Panama Papers leaks, for example, are doing an excellent work of that. There is great scholarship on global value chains. For example, Duncan Wigan and Leonard Seabrook at Copenhagen Business School are doing great work on kind of showing where these wealth networks, kind of how they're created and where money gets stashed. But in the grand scheme of things, so you mentioned the kind of the anonymity that allows for oligarchs to kind of to to hide the cash and and where it came from. So where it came from is kind of clear if you look hard enough, because you can trace the value chains if you look into concrete cases. But where it disappears is a bit more tricky, and that kind of anonymity, it's not invented by Russian oligarchs. It's invented by oligarchs in London and in the States and in Switzerland. Those what I call the kind of black holes in economy, in the global economy, in the kind of virtual spaces where accumulation can happen. They existed there before capitalism emerged in Ukraine or Russia. So the oligarchs who were emerging, who like through privatization and accumulation and concentration of various assets in what is now known as kind of big financial industrial groups or corporations in Ukraine or Russia or anywhere, those kind of oligarchs in the making, they simply used mechanisms that were already available to them in the global capitalist economy. And those spaces where they're by design, there is a reason why offshore zones exist. There is a reason why anonymity exists of various accounts and companies, and and confidentiality of accounts. It's because global capital has been trying to stash money away from the public for as long as public started gaining any ground throughout the history of class struggle. And it's always global labor against global capital, and it's more global or transnationalizing, as it's going to be more technical, as I call it in my book, now than it has ever been before. And so when we talk about oligarchs competing, it's not necessarily the states that are competing; it's various fractions of various capitalist classes that are in the state of competition, but they also have a shared interest, which is collective class interest, and they're all interested in protecting and harboring those spaces where their cash can be stashed. And we saw how toothless, how not very far-reaching their sanctions were towards Russian oligarchs, and and one of the reasons why those sanctions can't be significantly far-reaching is that for various assets to be properly frozen and taken away from various oligarchic groups, including their kind of satellite shell companies, then the rules of global offshore, for example, and transfer pricing and secrecy will need to be rewritten. And that will hit the oligarchs in the United States and the oligarchs in London and the oligarchs in Paris and the oligarchs in Switzerland.
Right.
And they don't want that happening, do they?
No.
Remember the Panama Papers, how much has changed? Remember the HSBC leaks on like money laundering of warlords and drug and arms dealers. How many people have ended up in prison?
Right. Yeah.
An absolute zero.
And this is something you talk about in the book, is just a lack of accountability for the powerful as evidence that things, still can't change. That question of accountability. And I guess like to that end, like right now we're seeing a pitched battle over the price of gas globally, and it's the crisis is being directly linked to global markets for oil. You have this really insightful article on the energy sector and socio-ecological transformation that unpacks a lot of the political economy dynamics around energy transition in a time of global upheaval, basically in relationship to this current moment. This is something that you've also talked about in terms of how Ukraine is reliant, like the rest of Europe, on Russian gas. So there's been a push across the globe to divest from Russian energy in the context of this specific crisis. So war is clearly now, indisputably about the links between energy and capital. So while there's all this virtual wealth, oil remains this kind of sludgy basis of the entire economy in some sense. I wonder to what extent you think these proliferating boycotts of Russian energy, with all of its financial and political ramifications, will actually, on the one hand, impact the global economy, and then on the other, potentially impact Putin's motivations.
Well, that's a very interesting question. And without being pessimistic, we've already seen a lot of backtracking on cutting off Russian gas and oil because, well, the connections are a little too strong. And the thing is that if we take Germany, for example, so Germany is a very energy intensive economy. There is this whole kind of banging on about Energiewende and greening, but what a lot of it was basically Germany writing in it's after unification, all of the Rust Belt industries of Eastern Germany, they were going to write off anyway, and their emissions into their starting kind of record. And then, of course, they could write off all of those enterprises and say, look how much we have decarbonized. So we have to be looking very carefully at those kind of greening figures.
Mm-hmm.
But they have a lot of industry, and their energy consumption is very high. And they're burning lignite. And, after Fukushima, they decided to get off nuclear. And now what we see, they have this kind of trade-off. So they were going to start using more gas. And now they're being told that they shouldn't be using gas. So they started talking about not phasing out nuclear, which is also bad news. Is you've looked at my stuff, so I have a very strong anti-nuclear position.
As do I.
And and we have this kind of very serious conundrum where the world is dependent on fossil fuels. It's not just Russian generally. We're kind of really hooked on oil and gas, and of course coal as well. Even though kind of some countries are moving away from that. So without meaningful, so in the short run, it will be interesting to see. There are some interesting negotiations between the United States and some Latin American countries about ramping up production. But again, you cannot increase oil production overnight. It takes months, at the very least. It's not turning on and off a tap. It's a much more complex process. So kind of diversifying supply of fossil fuels from other places is not something that's going to be very easy to achieve very quickly. And I cannot see switching off Russian gas and oil too easily, too quickly. United States, I know, have gone further in this than other countries have. But in terms of European consumption, it still remains to be seen what the final outcome will be. But one of the things that worries me is this kind of the resurrection of nuclear, because instead of, I was hopeful for a couple of days after there's been an occupation of the Chernobyl power plant, and then the Enerhodar power plant, which is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. And if that were to go wrong, the consequences would have been absolutely catastrophic, and that really freaked the whole of Europe out. And so instead of actually going, right, we need to move away from nuclear altogether, phase out all of these plants. We see Germany talking about potentially not decommissioning theirs. And you go, because we need to decarbonize and move away from Russian gas. And it's this kind of really schizophrenic, not to offend people with schizophrenia, a kind of attitude to energy politics, because we are consuming way too much. And this is a kind of the general span in the works of the green transition altogether, is that the elephant in the room is that we need to significantly scale back the consumption altogether. And before that happens, all of these dependencies and geopolitical problems will keep throwing the spanner in the works. And Putin will be he knows that how not necessarily very easy it is to switch from his supplies.
Right.
So we'll see kind of how it plays out. I think it's a bit early. I'm a bit worried. I do not want to kind of cast my final judgment on what the final terrain will look like. I thought I'd outline to you some of the aspects of the whole conversation that make me nervous at this point, but also quite skeptical.
Yeah, and I think what it does, and it's so valuable, is that it offers clarity in these deeply complex, conflictual times, and it thinks about the sort of knock-on effects in ways that are so important, because when you think about the kind of correlation between a military invasion, global oil prices, oil production, and these kind of geopolitical maneuverings, and the fundamental place of financial markets and kind of engineering all of those things, it becomes dizzying to try and picture the entire system functioning. It is a chaotic system in some fundamental way.
Yeah.
I just want to say, the other thing I appreciate is just the fact that you are centering people like workers, people who are just trying to survive, who are trying to subsist, who are trying to, care for themselves and their families and their communities. There's this line in your book where you say, the socioeconomic struggle of the everyday unifies Ukrainians, and acknowledgement of that solidarity is the biggest fear of the precarious rulers. That to me is like the thing, again, that provides a certain kind of moral clarity in your work. So I really, really appreciate you making this time to talk to me about it.
Thank you. I'm glad that you've saved the best for the last, because I'm just going to make this one final comment, because I think the living labor should be the focus of everything, and with that comes the ecological concerns, the concerns about women with blown up children in Mariupol, protection of human life and all life on this planet by looking after each other and after the world around us. And if we are to go seriously after oligarchs, and this is something I've said it at a demo in London before, and I keep banging on about it, and I will keep banging on about it before it happens. If we want to seriously stop value produced by people and nature leaking from the economy, and instead of and being misallocated in a way, because there is plenty of money and resources to go around to satisfy the needs of everyone on the planet. It's just there are some who are hoarding it and who are misallocating it. So if we are to de-oligarchize Ukrainian economy or any economy, we don't need some sort of commission that works on how to restructure the economy, as is now kind of being worked out in the cooperation with the EU and through these kind of different trade agreements. What we need is a transfer of oligarchic enterprises into collective ownership and management of its workers. Then the leakage, they will be interested, make it a collective, like give them shares, they're collective owners of it. They will not be interested in stealing money from it because it's their livelihood. They know how it works. They will not be interested in running it into disrepair. They want to have decent lives. They want to live near their families. Ukrainians don't want to be, some want to move abroad, but the majority are seeking a better fortune somewhere because they simply can't provide for their families and for themselves where they are. And that is a tragedy, and that brings tears to my eyes every single time I think about it. Like how much disruption to social fabric have neoliberal policies and politics and oligarchic kleptocracy have brought. And that has to end. And that can only end when Ukrainians are the true masters of their destiny, and when foreign corporations or domestic, because capital doesn't distinguish, just like wars don't, just like bombs don't. They take from you your livelihood, your will to live, your time, your creativity, and stash it in offshores on massive yachts. And that last bit needs to be eliminated. Make people in charge of their own destiny, and the world will bloom.
I really appreciate your words. And so thank you so much, Yuliya. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And I wish you all the best. I wish you safety and solidarity, and I wish you victory.
Thank you so much, Scott. That means a lot. It was lovely speaking with you. Let's stay in touch, and it was. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and let's hope that we see peace sooner than later, and that the scope of human suffering is as minimal as possible from now on.